I played my first titled player today. I was white in this 10-minute rapid game. The opponent's name on Lichess is kite1993. She's a women's international master, and her rapid rating on Lichess after about 50 games is 2275. Mine was 2272. But she's a much better player if we look at her stats. Her blitz is 2446, her classical is 2366, her bullet is 2350. So her rapid is her lowest rating. You compare to me, my blitz is only 2137. So I can tell she's a much stronger player. But I was very happy with the game that I ended up losing, and let's see how I lost. Okay, you can watch the clock times here at the top and bottom of the board if you're interested. So I was white. I opened with a queen's pawn, and we went into a queen's gambit declined. Knight to c3, knight f6. I've been studying the exchange variation a little bit lately, so I wanted to give that a try. So we exchanged on d5. Bishop g5 is the normal move. Knight Bd7 is not a normal move here. It's not the most popular. It's a fine move. There's nothing wrong with it. But it kind of threw me off a little bit in my opening prep. It could transpose, I suppose, to other lines that I'm used to. But anyway, I continued with e3 to support my d-pawn and get my bishop out. Bishop to e7 to break the pin on the knight, get ready to castle. Bishop d3, taking control of this diagonal. In the exchange variation, black often wants to get their light squared bishop to f5. h6, computer called that an inaccuracy. Too subtle for me though. I played bishop h4, although I realized I had an option of putting it on f4 as well. But h4 is fine. Castles. Knight ge2. So this is one of the benefits of the move order we played. I wasn't committed to an early knight to f3, so putting the knight on e2 allows this f-pawn to come to f3 to support a central pawn push. c6, guarding the d-pawn, blocking up the c-file. And here I think I made an inaccuracy. The computer doesn't call it an inaccuracy. I castle. But what I should have played was I should have taken the opportunity to play f3 right away. I never actually got in this plan. And the reason f3 should be played, I believe, is because castling allows the knight to come to e4. That's another plan black has a lot of times in the exchange variation, is trying to post a knight safely on e4. It is under attack twice and only defend it once, but the point is my bishop is on prise on h4, so I would have to exchange it, and then the queen comes and defends the knight as well. So the knight is sufficiently defended on e4. And if I push it away, that makes my e3 pawn weak. Like after an exchange here, the queen can grab that e-pawn. So the only way to get rid of it is to exchange one of my minor pieces for it, and then black can post a strong pawn on e4. So instead of castling, I have to study this a lot more. This opening, I should have been playing f3, I believe. But I castled. And instead of playing knight to e4 now, my opponent probably made an inaccuracy herself by playing rook to e8. The computer didn't call it an inaccuracy, but you can see the evaluation went from 0 to 0.5. This gives me another opportunity to play f3 in this position to keep the knight out of e4. But again, I didn't take it. I played queen c2, taking control of this diagonal. I was very nervous in this game. Had a hard time thinking. But now my opponent plays knight e4. She didn't have to prepare that move with rook to e8. She could have played it earlier, as I said, but rook e8 does help prepare it because after the exchange, now there are two pieces back here guarding e4 as well as the pawn. So that knight is hard to deal with. As I said, I can't push it away with the f-pawn and weaken my e3 pawn, which will get captured. If I capture it now with one of my minor pieces, then recapturing with the pawn is going to block me out of that diagonal, and that pawn becomes pretty strong, and it stops my expansion in the center. So I decided to go for the minority attack here, and I was about to play one of my rooks to b1 to support the pawn push until I realized, hey, I can push that pawn without guarding it. And I did, and the point is when black took the pawn with her queen, that gave up partial control of e4, so I can win my pawn back on e4 like that. And that's what happened in the game. The computer suggested not actually taking the pawn on b4. Let's have a look. The engine. Yeah, the engine prefers knight d to f6 to further support the knight on e4 and open the diagonal for the bishop and just get on with development. But she does put an end to any minority attack, and then I trade knights here and gain my pawn back. So I was happy with the opening here. I have a central majority here, you could call that, two central pawns to none, and I'm perfectly safe in this position. So I can make use of the half-open B and C file, so I was very happy. Then knight f6 attacks my bishop, opens up the diagonal for the light-squared bishop. Bishop d3 retreats it. Bishop e6 I thought was an inaccuracy. Looks like a good square to put the bishop. Where else are you going to develop it to? But that does allow me to play knight to f4 to attack it. And there's not a good place to put the bishop without trading it off. She put it on d5, and I took the opportunity to take the bishop. I was surprised she recaptured with the c pawn getting an isolated d pawn here, but I suppose it's not so weak. There's no open file to the isolated pawn, so I'd have to attack it from the side or behind later on in an endgame. It can be defended, and the computer didn't complain. It's just as good as taking with the knight, apparently. Then I played rook a b1, attacking the queen and the pawn behind it, and this forces black to move the queen back to e7 to guard the pawn. Then rook fc1, so I've got my two rooks exactly on the files I want them, and I'm very happy with the opening, but I am spending a lot more time than my opponent. She's got 2 minutes more than I have. So she's a quicker player, more knowledgeable, and I'm slow, and that's one of my downfalls. So b6 to get that pawn guarded by the a pawn, free the queen, block the b file. Queen c7 was kind of a foolish move, kind of hoping for a trade of queens and posting a rook on the 7th rank and getting another rook behind it. And I didn't realize that she has queen to a3, forking the bishop and the pawn, forcing my queen right back. So I had to play my queen back to c2 to guard both of those threats. But the engine didn't really complain, didn't blink. I still have this +1 advantage. Knight to e4, second time she played knight to e4 in the game. Strong place to put the knight. It is defended by the pawn and the rook. Rook to b3 attacks the queen, drives it back. It posts itself on b5, and that was a mistake, Lichess calls it, or a blunder, if not just a mistake, but I didn't take advantage of it. I had the move rook to b5 in this position, guarded by my bishop, forking the queen and pawn, and I would win that important center pawn. So that isolated D pawn can become a liability. It is something you have to watch out for. But unfortunately, I didn't take advantage of that. After queen to a5, I decided to take the knight and then triple up on the c file. Figuring I have a slight advantage, I'm safe, and I now have a passed d pawn. Okay, so my opponent plays rook a d8, trying to activate their rooks, kind of work around the c file here that I have control over. Queen to b3, I want to put a rook on the 7th rank, and I want to attack that pawn. I want to keep my eye on my a pawn here. Rook comes up to e6. Maybe it's kind of ambitious, a little rook lift over here. She wants to get the queen and the rook, and she wants to start attacking me. She is still 2 minutes ahead on the clock, and I kind of panic here and take the time to get a little lift for my king before analyzing any further. And then my opponent plays rook to d5, a second rook lift here, and the computer didn't like that. It called it an inaccuracy, but it only went from +1 to +1.3. But that did allow rook to c8 check, forcing the king over to the side of the board, and then I can post my rook on the 7th rank after driving the king away from protection of this pawn. And this is actually a rook fork, and now I'm starting to see this a little bit clearer as I say this. Why this is really an inaccuracy here, rook to d5. It's probably worse than the engine is saying it is because of this two-move sequence. Rook to c8 check forces king to h7 followed by rook to c7. That was a forced two-move sequence, and it's a fork. I'm threatening this pawn, but I'm also threatening this pawn because if the queen takes my rook in response, she's left protection of the d5 rook, and I can take that. So I'm going to win a pawn in this position. I didn't actually see that, though. I saw that in analysis. I didn't see that this pawn was under attack, so I didn't realize this was a fork. But I was lucky that my opponent blundered with rook to f5. Actually, it doesn't call it a blunder, but from my point of view, it looked like a blunder in the middle of the game. But apparently, there was nothing better. So the point is the rook is now guarding this pawn, and that's what we both had our eyes on. I suppose we weren't looking at that a pawn. But I saw a tactic here. I took that pawn anyway because I just removed the defender of the e6 rook. So if she takes my rook, I get the other rook. And my queen is still guarding that a pawn from far away. So I was happy to win this pawn, and I felt really good except for the fact I only had 2.5 minutes, and my opponent is still 2 minutes up on me. Okay, so I'm attacking her rook on f5. No, I'm not. She's got to guard it with her queen. But I can trade and make my pawn advantage a little bit better. But she moves rook to g6, and I do trade. But that brings her queen over here, and her queen and her rook are going to harass me. She's got a threat right now, I noticed. Queen takes h3 because the pawn on g2 is pinned by the rook. So this took a lot of my calculational time trying to stop her attack on the king side. I played king to f1 to step out of the pin. She plays queen to g5 to threaten g2 here. So I push to g3, and then queen to f5 threatens the h3 pawn, and I play king to g2 to guard it. And I did notice that allows the queen to come into f3 with check, but I'm perfectly safe falling back to g1. The engine agrees with me, still gives me a +2 advantage. But I only have 1 minute left on the clock at this point. Look how much time I let go just staring at this attack over here. And she barely used any time on her clock in the last few moves. She's got 4.5 minutes left. So she plays rook to f6, continuing to attack me, attacking the f2 pawn. I guard it laterally with my queen. She pushes h5. I probably should have just pushed h4 here, but I did play rook to e1. I guess I was preparing, I do remember now I was preparing queen to e2, trying to eject the queen from that square. Then she plays h4, and she's starting to come back in the evaluation, and here's where I blunder away my advantage. I follow through and play queen to e2. The computer suggested that I push this pawn, which I probably wouldn't have thought of in the game because it drops this pawn over here, but the point is it leaves protection of this center pawn, and I'm now protecting this pawn, and I'm just fine. In fact, I can force the trade of queens in here by playing queen to g2 at some point, and this h-pawn is not really a threat. So I think this was the way to hold my advantage, was to just push g4 and lock up the situation. But instead I play queen to e2, allowing the h-pawn to take g3. I do trade queens, but it's not enough to preserve any advantage because she comes in with her rook and protects her g-pawn. So we trade g-pawns. I come over to protect my h-pawn. But she comes to f3, threatening a check here, maybe getting behind my passed pawn or even taking my a-pawn. And from this point out, it's all zeros. It's just a drawn endgame, but I only have 36 seconds left. So I start pushing my d-pawn, allowing the check, but my king comes up. She wisely gets behind the passed pawn rather than wasting time taking the a-pawn. But this does allow me to come up and grab her e-pawn. So I still retain equality in this endgame, 3 pawns each. She goes for my h-pawn, and I let her take it because I've got this passed e-pawn for compensation. I didn't want to passively guard that h-pawn. And my decision was correct according to the engine. I'm still all zeros. And I push my e-pawn. She brings her king over to stop it, and a good move here is rook f1 to just cut the king off from this file so this king and pawn can work themselves up the board as compensation for being down a pawn, and there's nothing black can really do. She played rook to h2 to go after the a-pawn. I push my pawn further. She plays rook to d2 check. And this is where my time ran out, and I'm sad my time ran out in a perfectly drawn position. But I'm very happy to have played a titled player. So thanks for watching the video.